Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Scholastic webinar this afternoon, Words Matter, Building Language Skills to Create a Positive Learning Environment. We are really excited to be with you today, and I'm very honored to have our two panelists that are going to be sharing so many really helpful insights around language and vocabulary. So I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Tricia Zucker, who is a professor and co-director at the Children's Learning Institute at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston. And Dr. Zucker's work, she's a lead researcher behind an amazing research-based program called Developing Talkers and Hablemos Juntos. Not a native Spanish speaker, so I may have butchered that, but that's the Spanish version of Developing Talkers. And it's really a groundbreaking oral language development program that is designed to really expand children's receptive and expressive vocabulary skills. So we're going to be hearing a lot more about that. And I'm also just thrilled to introduce Pamela Horvath, who is from Dallas Independent School District. And Pamela is the PreK Instructional Strategy Coordinator, 19 years in education. She oversees the PreK curriculum, professional learning, and assessment for Dallas ISD. So with our panelists today, we're very excited to really get started. And as we go into our slides, I want to share that each of you today who are attending will receive a 1-hour professional development certificate for attending today. And Colin, there we go. So for today's goals, what we're really looking at doing is exploring that recent research and those best practices in developing oral language and vocabulary in the early learning classroom, both from the thought of the research behind that, as well as the practice of how it really looks in the classroom. And to do that, with Pamela's expertise, we're going to really learn how a high-performing district is utilizing high-quality instructional resources that are really going to help ensure teachers and students are supported in implementing best practices in a pre-K classroom. And we're very excited also to give you a little sneak peek of Scholastic's new pre-K curriculum, PreK on My Way, which was built based on the research that we are going to discuss today. Why is this important? We know that research says that preschool programs that really demonstrate strong and persistent positive effects and use developmentally appropriate programs and practices and provide adequate learning time for the teachers are really going to make a difference. Well, we knew that, but we also knew that at Scholastic, we wanted to bring in the foremost experts in that. So we were very excited to be able to partner with Dr. Zucker and the Children's Learning Institute to really gain their expertise and bring those practices and those strategies into a new program. So with that, we really want to talk a little bit more today about why we're going to focus on oral language. And so we're going to be able to talk about kind of how we've done that in this new program. But I'm going to turn it to Dr. Zucker today. And can you share your thoughts, Tricia, on really why it's so important that we spend some time today focusing on oral language?
Well, I am happy to do that. And I also, before I start, I just want to say I'm enjoying seeing some of the comments in the chat. I think Colin dropped in a little prompt about putting down your favorite children's book from your childhood. So go ahead and take a minute to do that and mention where you're from if you haven't already, because we will come back to this as we're talking today. So what's language? Why does it matter? Language is obviously just the systems of words that we use to communicate to one another. And we all know it develops from birth. Infants begin to learn their first words, around that first birthday. Toddlers are putting together multiple word sentences. And by the preschool period, you should see children using complex sentences that include multi-word responses to almost every question you ask them. So language is just really critical because it supports all academic success as well as social and emotional learning. It's how you get what you need.
Thank you. That is really helpful. So we know that oral language and vocabulary are really connected to every single aspect of literacy. So when we think about that, can you both talk a little bit about why building this foundation in pre-K is just so vitally important? Pamela, let's start with you on that one.
Okay, thanks. And just really happy to be here with everybody. So in most cases, pre-K is the first time that students they're in a classroom, they're around other children their age. So it's just a really great opportunity for them to learn how to talk with others and to build those relationships. And oral language is a way to tell stories and to tell stories about our lives and build those relationships with others. And it also builds confidence in students. And that confidence just gets the students excited about their future education and just continuing to tell their own stories about their own lives and connecting to the stories that they read and the stories that they hear throughout their pre-K and throughout their education. So it's just a really important part of it.
I love that you mentioned confidence, because that is such an important part of all of this, and like really helping build that through the ability of really increasing their language and vocabulary. So glad you pointed that out. And Tricia, can you weigh in on your thoughts around that?
Well, yeah, I'd ask Colin to show our slides again, because I've really put together this little visual that comes from the Regional Education Lab in Florida. It's called the literacy tree. And what I love about it is that it shows on the right how language and vocabulary, they are essential sort of foundational components to becoming a good reader. This is obvious, I'm sure, to everyone on the call, but that's really why you can't start too early to build literacy skills by just simply getting kids talking about very rich conversational topics.
That literacy tree is really that's something that I hope every teacher really sees and thinks about. It's really a great visual that shows all those connections and how they're made. So when we're talking about this, I'm fascinated about like brain research. What happens to the brain during all of these conversations as these are going on?
So there's a whole lot happening in the brain during any sort of linguistic interaction. And this just shows you the left side of the brain where the majority of language processing occurs. So part of what we know from brain imaging studies that are really some of the most cutting edge work coming out in recent years from groups at Harvard and elsewhere is that if you want to see this left side of the brain really light up for young children while they're doing things like listening to stories, it is not just the number of words you sort of pump into the conversation, not just quantity of words. It is the quality and depth of your conversation that actually mediates the brain growth, right? The relationship between that conversation they've heard with adults around them and children's actual end of year language outcomes. And these are the things that matter most to us as educators, right? We want to see language outcomes growing because we know that sets them up for success in school. So really the secret to brain building conversations is back and forth conversational turns where you are going deep into a topic rather than just thinking about the quantity of words you've said to a kid.
That's really that's making my light bulb go off, because I think as an educator for 20 years, I know that I wanted to talk all day, every day, but I think that I was thinking more about quantity sometimes than quality. So that's a really good point to bring out. And Pamela, as we hear about this and you think about the practice in your classrooms in Dallas, what are some of the ways that your teachers are finding to get successful conversations going in those classrooms?
Well, yeah, in DISD, our pre-K teachers, we are really, really working on those oral language skills. And I like to call it the buzz sound in the classroom, getting the classroom buzzing and getting them to talk. And some of the ways that we do that in our classrooms, of course, is we have our warm greetings, giving the students a chance to come into the classroom, talk to the teachers, talk to their friends. We also have breakfast in the classroom, so that's a great opportunity for our kids to talk and our teachers to have those conversations with them. We have our morning meeting. We have lots of moving and learning opportunities with our students, lots of breaks with our students. And of course, now that we have this rich reading read-alouds with Scholastics, we're using that. And we're having a lot of conversations in our large group time, I think, that we weren't having before, with our small group time, our independent practice. It just leans itself to that conversations. And so now we're working on our teachers, giving them that wait, or teaching them how to have that wait time, and not being the ones that are talking all the time.
That's a great point, the wait time, which sometimes I think all of us as teachers are hard. It's really hard to hold back on that, right? Great point. So, Tricia, you talked about kind of like the volley. So when we're talking about what you feel is an effective conversation in a preschool classroom, can you share a little bit more about that and kind of take us a little deeper around that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is sort of a visual aid that we like to use that shows just how one of those longer, rich sort of brain building conversations might unfold in the classroom. So it would start with the teacher asking a nice open-ended question, that kind that elicits a multiple word response, because we know that even toddlers and preschoolers are very capable of telling us more than a one-word answer. So when a child then responds to you, this is the critical moment to actively listen as an educator and think, okay, what have they said to me? Are they tracking? Or was that an accurate response, or is it an inaccurate response? So that moment is part of what Pamela just talked about, is just wait time, right? So that the teacher too can think, what do I say next? It's about to be my turn in the conversation. And what is it I'm going to do at step 3? Am I going to take this conversation up a notch and challenge this child? Or do I need to step things down a notch and make it a little easier for them because they didn't respond in a way that showed me that they understood what we were saying, or they didn't understand the question in the book that we're talking about? So that moment, that step 3, is just a really beautiful time for scaffolding. And we can talk more today about lots of ways to scaffold conversations, but that also opens up another opportunity for the child to then respond again. And finally, the teacher can close out that conversation by just, recasting what the child said, or maybe expanding on their utterance. But these sorts of 5-turn conversations where you really serve up a question and the child returns that back to you, and you serve up another question, sort of back and forth, that beautiful, very natural volley is, again, what the most cutting edge research is telling us is predictive of children's language outcomes. So these are the brain building moments, is when we have a strive for 5 goal to really pull language from these young learners, not to ask one question and then see who knows the answer. Oh, you didn't know? Let me see if Susie knows, because she's back in the back, always raising her hand. So we'll avoid that. We will stay with that child, no matter whether they responded accurately or not, so that they can have a warm conversation with their teacher who scaffolds and also just shows them, I see you, I hear you, and really builds trust in whatever it is they've said, whatever level they are able to respond.
So in thinking about that, in small group, which is such an important time during the day to really kind of solidify some of that learning, how would you see this in a small group? How do educators utilize this in small group instruction, do you think? Trish, I'll start with you, and then I'll go to Pam and see what thought she has on that.
This is really naturally one of the most important times of day to have a back and forth conversation. It's when you're going to be able to strive for 5 and it really feel effortless, because there's just fewer things that you're monitoring at that moment. So it's this time of year when you should really be asking yourself, okay, we're in the beginning of November. Can my kids work independently at workstations or centers? If not, then, building those skills is key so that they can start to join you in a small group and go back into conversations where you review the book, you review the vocabulary you're talking about that day. And of course, you're going to have other literacy related small groups, but I'm talking about language small groups where you are digging deeper into the vocabulary that and just the conversational topics that you're trying to really get kids thinking about.
Pamela, when you're thinking about a small group in your teachers' classrooms and you're doing professional learning, what are your thoughts about the conversations that have to happen in small group and using the Strive for Five? Do you have some thoughts about that?
My first thought is fantastic, really. We call it a feedback loop, which is something that we are working with our teachers and our students with consistently with our coaches that are out in our campuses. And just kind of what Dr. Zucker said, just those small groups, being able to ask more questions. And that's something that we're definitely working on in our classrooms. And again, I'm going to go back to the pre-K on my way. Those small group interactions that are already built in already have those questions there for the teachers, to go through in those small groups, and allows them to reteach that vocabulary, allows them to have those conversations with the group. And the other thing about the small groups is going back to that confidence. It builds that confidence. If I'm with a small group, as opposed to this 200 participant group, it is much easier to have that conversation with that small group and builds that confidence in the students to be able to take chances with vocabulary and with their oral language skills. So it's definitely something that we really work on and is extremely important in this world.
That's awesome that you have the focus on that, because it does make such a difference in that time in small group. And I know that's also a challenge, is just, we have folks probably with half-day schedules, full-day schedules, and trying to get that meaningful small group in a half day is so important. But I think we probably all agree that we have to make sure that that's a central part of the day, no matter what our schedule is. So the other thing that's really something I want to get into a little bit is around interactive read aloud, and whether that's whole group, small group, whenever that is. But when we're thinking about Strive for Five, how do we implement a strategy around the interactive read aloud and interactive reading? Tricia?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I was just training a group of preschool teachers on Monday, and we talked a lot about this because one of the things that happens during storybook reading is interactive questions, right? We want to be asking kids questions, not passively listening to a story. Actually, our research shows that used to be common back in the early 90s, but now educators know that reading is more effective when kids are talking about the book. And you can see almost everyone talks about the book, no matter whether we're looking at teachers in Texas, Ohio, or elsewhere that we've been doing our research. And some of what we have observed is that you want to make sure that interactive read aloud has really thoughtful questions planned, some big, meaty questions. We often call these like a guiding question that would give kids a purpose for listening to a book, because kids need to hear stories read a couple of times, really multiple times, to be able to take away the rich vocabulary that's in those books and to be able to make important thematic connections that develop that world knowledge and social and emotional knowledge that is going to be layered into the books you're reading. So really interactive read alouds, you might start with a nice guiding question before you read, asking a couple of questions during reading, but also not getting bogged down during reading with too long of conversations. That might not be when you strive for five. You might figure out how to really change so that your strive for five happens after reading. And that's a big shift for a lot of teachers. A lot of them, they often want to really go in depth with a comment a child brought up during reading. And you do want to make space for that during reading. But keep in mind, there are 3 parts to a read aloud: before, during, and after reading. Before reading, I recommend you pre-teach some vocabulary and give a guiding question so that kids have a reason to listen. During reading, make space for kids to talk, but also keep the reading going, right? We can't lose the full narrative, right? And expect our classroom management to go well, right? Kids will be rolling around on the back of the floor if I strive for five with every kid I talk to during the story. So maybe the way to do it is to have yourself really planning for your Strive for Five to happen after reading. It's the most achievable place that teachers we work with find that they can really set a goal of, okay, I'm going to go back and forth and have a meaningful conversation with the 2 to 3 kids who I asked the guiding question to, because we can answer it after reading. And so that's a very long way of saying that Strive for Five it's super easy within the context of book reading, but being thoughtful about it maybe happening after you've read the story is what I would recommend.
Very interesting, because I think that might be surprising to a lot of us who think it has to happen like all during the read aloud. So I love the thought of Strive for Five after. Pamela, what do you think about that as you're working with PreK My Way? How have the teachers in your schools kind of responded to a built-in interactive reading strategy?
Well, I just want to first say I love the fact that Dr. Zucker said you could read the book more than once. That is awesome. Thank you.
Here. Yep.
Because so often we read a book once and we put it down. And with this program, of course, they're reading it more than once. There's lots of those questions in here. And by the way, this is one of our Dallas ISD teachers here. So thank you. But as you can see in this picture, this was not a setup. You can see that she has everything out that she needs, and she has those questions there with her. And I think going to this from the students' perspective of this, they love it because they get to be part of it. The interactive reading, they get to be part of it. And I agree with Dr. Zucker, you can't let it get out of hand. You want to let them talk, but that's always where you could say something like, just keep that thought, we'll get back to it. Maybe the teacher writes it down. Maybe the student puts it on a Post-it note, something to remember to go back to that question and those thoughts, because sometimes these kids, including us big kids, we can go on and on and on about something. So the teachers really need to practice that. What if the student, continues on with the question? So in answer to your short answer to your question, the interactive read alouds just are super fun for the kids. And, by the end of the week, they're even helping the teachers read the books and learning the words and understanding and pointing at things. So it's been a joy to watch that happen.
Thank you for that. That's really good insight. And I do want to ask Tricia, as far as the read aloud and revisiting the read aloud in a week, what would your recommendation be? What does best practice say to us?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would tell you that research hasn't actually asked that specific question of like how many times in a week, but what we do know from many decades of research studies is that repeated readings are the most effective way to build comprehension and language. So the studies have looked at anywhere from 2 to 4 repeated readings of a book, and that always is superior for children's learning when compared to 1 reading of a book. So I know you might be tired of reading Goodnight Moon or this book you see here, The Snowy Day, to your kids, but they're not tired of it. It's like when we watch a favorite movie like Princess Bride or something over and over, Star Wars over and over. Well, it's the same thing with a book. Kids are picking up on new things every time you read it, new things that the author has said or not said. And that really brings us to kind of some of this slide. And I know you have some particular questions about this, Kathy, but I will say, the questions we ask during a read aloud, they should be a combination of more concrete questions that we can answer very literally from information in the book itself, the information in the pictures. So like for this book, The Snowy Day, your question might be related to how, snow had fallen during the night. A concrete question would just be, well, what was the weather like? Or when did it snow, right? The author told you those things. But teachers, even at the preschool and toddler level, can ask some abstract questions. And so this is something that we often see is lacking in preschool classrooms in particular. Teachers are asking mostly easy questions, yet these kids are ready for abstract questions like, later in the story when Peter can't find his snowball that he put in his pocket, you can ask a nice abstract question like, well, why was his snowball gone? The author didn't exactly tell you, but you can use your background knowledge to figure out, oh, he brought a snowball into the warm house. Of course, it melted, right? So those are the effective combinations of both concrete and abstract questions during reading.
I'm hoping that's really helpful to our attendees today, because I think that a lot of teachers, we don't know like where to even start and kind of how to lay out those questions. And Pam, do you have anything, like any other thoughts around this, is like how you develop like concrete, abstract, open-ended? Have you done professional learning for your teachers to kind of help guide them with that?
We have done a little bit, but we definitely need to do more. And I think my thoughts around that are that we are struggling. We are struggling with asking those questions and afraid to ask those questions. Like I always tell our teachers, in pre-K, we can do anything. Like the worst thing I ever hear is, oh, pre-K can't do that. Pre-K can't write. Pre-K can't read. Pre-K can't. And I'm always striving to say, we can do those things. Our pre-K kids can do those things. It's just not going to look like a fifth grade, a fifth grade classroom. And a lot of our questioning techniques, we're thinking as an adult, and we really need to think about what, like Dr. Zucker said, like what is that kid seeing in that picture that we might not be seeing? Because so many times I've done a read aloud and kids see things that we don't see. So just allowing them that opportunity to talk about what they're hearing, talk about what they're seeing. And I like, the open-ended questions, just the why, the hows, the continuing, the who's, the what's, and just letting kids really get into the book and not just on our time, giving it to them and allowing them to enjoy the pictures on their time. And that's sometimes a struggle for educators because there's always a timeline, right?
Yeah, planning time, that lack of planning time.
And that would be another thing, is just planning. A lot of times we just need planning time. And what questions are you going to ask? And what could the responses be? And how are you going to respond to those responses? Are big things in the planning realm.
I'm glad we brought this up to the forefront, because I think it is something that all of us, if we can find a block of time to help us really kind of focus on those questions during an interactive read aloud, it's definitely going to make a difference for the children. So we've been talking a little bit about small group, about circle time, story time. And Colin, if you can go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about peer-to-peer. And as our little ones really interact with each other, that might be an opportunity to really help around language and vocabulary as well. So Pamela, I'd love to know how your teachers bring that in, or what your thoughts are as far as peer-to-peer interactions in the pre-K classroom.
Well, in Dallas, we talk a lot about regard for student perspective and giving students autonomy. We encourage this a lot through our SEL practices and our relationship building. And in reading more about this peer-to-peer language, it's definitely something that I want to talk more with our teachers about. But I think that going back to the SEL practices our teachers are great at in Dallas ISD, I think that those just lend themselves to these kids having the peer-to-peer language interactions, because they do feel comfortable with each other. And the teachers provide that safe environment for the classrooms. But I think that it's definitely something, again, as I did more research on it, it's definitely something that we will continue to educate our teachers on, because just the idea of the kids helping each other and the kids showing each other and talking things through is something I don't think we can do enough of.
Great points. Tricia, any thoughts on that to build upon what Pamela's shared?
Yeah, I completely agree that peer-to-peer conversations, that it's a really golden moment to support language interactions. And it's, as a teacher, you don't have to do much more than really create routines, whether it's during playtime or mealtime, where kids, they learn that they want to hear one another's perspectives. They learn, I can ask you questions, and we're really going to talk to one another. This is something too, as a teacher, you want to be really thoughtful about making sure you are thinking about your English learners, or kids who may have language delays or just feel shy. be strategic about pairing them up during free play or outdoor time with someone who is going to be able to really have a conversation with them, right? And even if it's as simple as, you know what, I want you guys to ask each other a question about these particular toys, or, these particular balls that I'm going to hand to you and your partner, because you're going to get to use them first on the playground today. All of those are ways that you can really not only support this social and emotional development, social skill, pragmatic skills, but also there's going to be a lot of language interactions happening. And I'll say that from a research perspective, peer effects are a sort of understudied area. We haven't looked at this a whole lot compared to some of the other things about language, where we have decades of research telling us that what adults say to kids matters and it drives language outcomes. But we're finding it's not just that. Peers affect each other tremendously. And so peer effects for language are very real and something that you want to think about. How can I really use the other kids in this class to elevate the language of some kids that I really want to support?
Very thought-provoking, because I do feel like it's an area that sometimes we really haven't focused on before. So it's possibly another really great, these are great strategies that we can incorporate in our classrooms. I want to move on and talk a little bit about vocabulary, which we've talked a lot about language and building language. And the other part of that is vocabulary. And I'm wondering, Tricia, from your research, what stood out to you about the most important part about gaining vocabulary from children's books for our children? What did you find out from research that was interesting?
Well, yeah, we absolutely have known for quite some time that children's books contain very rich vocabulary, more rich vocabulary than what you're even going to find in college level courses or in a courtroom. It's been compared to all those sorts of things. So this is just a fantastic resource, is to find a high quality children's book. And honestly, that's what Scholastic is known for, is just having a lot of good books. So that's one of the reasons we love partnering with you. But yeah, most recently, one of my colleagues at Ohio State just finished a study that demonstrates that just simply exposing kids to reading, routinely, it doesn't even have to be each and every day, but maybe 4 to 5 times a week, exposes them to more than 1 million words than they would have heard without routine shared reading. So it's just one of the most simple and effective ways to bring really rich vocabulary into your classroom, is to pull out a great book. And Kathy, I don't know if you're going to bring this up again later, but you all put some of your favorite books in the chat, and some of those like Chrysanthemum or The Kissing Hand, they're these amazing narratives that have fantastic vocabulary words in them. We were just teaching words from The Kissing Hand, at that training I was at on Monday. Excellent words in that book. But what I noticed is that there was only one book that had even a slight bit of informational content to it, and that was a Curious George book. So, I would also recommend to you that if you want to find books with really good vocabulary words, you're going to have to pull out some informational text. There's a lot of excellent informational text for preschool children nowadays that often overlay a narrative with the factual, correct information that they're presenting to you. And that's just one of my favorite parts about the PreK on My Way, is that you're going to find books like Baby on Board, where kids are learning all about animals and comparing animal behavior to human behavior, but they're also learning some really nice technical vocabulary that, as Pamela said, pre-K children can do this. They can learn those more challenging words if we give them something like a beautiful book to start to think about those things.
Great point about the informational text. And I think sometimes teachers in the past, it was more difficult to find it. And fortunately, I think we're very excited, because I know at Scholastic, I'm finding new titles pretty much every month for informational texts that are appropriate for our pre-K children. So you've talked about using the books. How do they actually learn these words then? What's the process of actually acquiring that vocabulary?
Yeah, so there's really 2 ways that kids learn words, and that's indirectly or directly. So you actually do learn most words in your vocabulary just indirectly. You can figure out what words mean from conversation, from books, and those sorts of things, particularly conversations with adults or repeated readings of books. So that's one of the most common ways to learn words. Also, as kids get older, if you become a avid reader and read extensively, then that also increases your vocabulary. So those are some of the ways that you can learn words indirectly. But of course, you can also learn words directly from a teacher or an adult telling you what a word means. So kids will often ask adults, what does that mean? What does that mean? Well, that is a golden moment to slow down whatever you are doing, because that is a cue that if a child asks, what does this word mean, they're using their best word learning strategy, right? Preschoolers can't go look it up in the dictionary. They need you to give them a child-friendly definition that explains what a word means without using another sophisticated word to define that already sophisticated or unknown word. So that's things like you see here. There's big words like coincidence. You can explain this in a very child-friendly way using perhaps the definition here, and also just using the word in an interesting sentence, like, wouldn't it be an interesting coincidence if you both brought spaghetti for lunch, right? So those sorts of things help children hear a word multiple times. Kids are going to need 6 to 12 exposures to a new word before it becomes part of their vocabulary, part of their lexicon. So that brings us, back to the repeated reading and those ongoing small group conversations where they're going to have those other opportunities to hear those words again and again.
6 to 12 exposures. That is, I don't think I realized that either. So that's definitely, those repeated readings become very, very important. Pamela, how does this work in practice, or any tips around how you all are doing this with your pre-K classrooms?
I feel like Dr. Zucker said it all. That was just wonderful. And I want to say one of the things that I always like to bring out with vocabulary is having the students kind of think of within reason a definition of their own. Like, what do they think this means? What do they by the picture, what do they think it means? Because many times they can figure it out, like talked about with context. Like, you're looking at the word celebrate and they see the picture of the party. Well, what does celebrate mean? These children are celebrating, and they come up with definitions, and I feel like it allows them to own the word, and they walk away owning that word. And I know I used to do that in my classroom. The kids would learn new words and they would go home and they would use them in the context they were meant to use them. And here's another one of our Dallas ISD teachers. You'll see, with the thinking map there, and all of her tools, just talking about the vocabulary. And that's another thing I do like about the pre-K on my way. It's very intentional on how the vocabulary is being used, and it allows the teachers to review those words, introduce those words, talk about the words, repeat the words, and the kids also hear them in the read-alouds. So there's, hopefully by the end of the week, going back to that 6 to 12, they've heard that word 6 to 12 times by the end of that week, possibly even by day 3, looking at some of the lessons. So it's a very important part, but it's also important to extend the usage of those vocabulary words outside of just the read aloud and outside of just that week. So owning the words is a good way to do that.
Yeah, and I want to just react to one thing that Pam said. Giving kids opportunities to own the words and use the words is so important. And you can see kind of the routine on the back of these cards gives kids an opportunity to say the word. That's really important to establish a phonological representation of a new word, like celebrated or coincidence. You have to say it. That's how you establish that representation in your brain. The second step is to just give the child-friendly definition of the word. This is something that we talk a good bit about in trainings too, is there are some words like celebration or celebrated that you can ask young children, what do you think this word means? And they're going to give you a reasonable answer, a reasonable definition. But oftentimes you have to be careful, right? Children are quite likely to give an answer that sort of brings the group off track and then can perseverate on these things. So if I ask, what does a coincidence mean? And we go down some rabbit hole, you might just sort of think to yourself, okay, some of these words that are very likely to be new to all kids in my class, I should just tell them explicitly and directly what the word means straight up, right? Just like you would do if you were teaching a new letter, right? We're not going to ask them to infer what the letter B sound is. We're going to just tell them that B says, right? So, those are the sorts of things that, again, I love that a definition is already queued up for me as a teacher, and I can really quickly go back to that definition over and over, whether it's before reading, getting kids excited to, put your thumb up, listen for the word celebrate as I read our book today, or to really just revisit the word when you come to it in a book and say, oh, this was one of our special words we were listening for today, celebrated, and remember, here's what it means. So yeah, also playful ways to own those words, like acting out the words, is really important too for young kids. That gives them just another one of those 6 to 12 opportunities they need to say and use a word and make it part of their own vocabulary.
This is so helpful. I think I would have loved to have had this as a teacher, because just that child-friendly definition alone, trying to figure out what is appropriate, this is so helpful. As we talk about vocabulary, I know you also talk a little bit about a network of words, Tricia. Can you share a little bit more about, walk us through this and what your thoughts are around a network of words?
Right. So we often teach words that are related like this, and there's actually a really good reason for it, according to just sort of brain research, and that's that we do organize our thinking and our lexicon. That's our just mental sort of vocabulary list of words we know into networks, as you can see here, where we have a whole lot of words that might be connected to a big topic like weather. And so it's just an example that shows you how kids might learn a whole slew of amazing and important words by the end of a unit on weather or seasons. And so it's just, really making sure that you are helping to make connections between words like umbrella and drizzle, or drizzle and other words, that all can be connected into this larger sort of web of words and network of words. And again, there's very recent research coming out of Florida and Florida State showing that preschool children, they better learn sets of words when they are taught sort of in groups that are thematically connected, like the network you see here. Or I think the next slide might also show a very similar sort of network of words. So just keeping in mind that as you're picking which words to teach in a unit, making sure that they're related is going to improve that word learning.
So there were a lot of words there, and there's a lot of words in the wonderful text that we're reading. How do educators really determine which words to focus on? Like, to me, that was another struggle for me in the classroom. And Pamela, I don't know if you agree with that, and we'll come back and get your thoughts, but Tricia would love to know, how do we select?
Yeah, so the good news is you don't have to teach basic words. Those sorts of common words like phone or book, those don't require your direct instructional time. Even English learners will be able to figure out what these words mean with very little instruction. Or simply with just you pointing at pictures as you read, or gesturing as you normally would when speaking to young children. So you want to focus most of your instruction for vocabulary around the second 2 categories of words you see there. Sophisticated words that are more domain general, and those more domain specific words that are more technical words. And so, these are the words of mature language users. These are the words that you're going to read all throughout the grade levels. Words like clever, complicated, frustrated, you're going to find those, even as you grow up and read the newspaper, right? The other thing is that those technical words at the bottom, those should be taught when you are doing something like a science experiment, or you're reading a social studies book, because young kids, as Pamela said, pre-K can do anything. They can learn those technical words if you just teach them what they mean. So, this is just an example from one of our parent programs. It's a STEM program after school, and we see kids learning all sorts of big words. They like to walk around and talk about how I'm gathering data, or I'm exploring photosynthesis. And preschoolers can learn these things when given both informational text that we've talked about, as well as, science and other sort of rich activities that really link up to a network of words that it may even be more technical. So don't be afraid. Teach them those big words. They can handle it.
Pamela, thoughts on that? Have you, anything that you've found specifically successful as far as teaching vocabulary in the pre-K classrooms?
I go back to what you said earlier. A lot of this I wish I knew as a younger teacher. Like I had asked Dr. Zucker, was that similar to the tier 1 and tier 2 3 words? I didn't, it was years after teaching or during teaching when I learned that. And just understanding that some of those words, like she said, kids are already going to know, like automatically. And just looking at ways that you can teach those technical words and through science. And that's another thing I love about pre-K on my way is that, we do have those informational texts. And going back to that idea, I was probably afraid of informational text when I was a child, and then so moving into teaching 20 years ago, I was afraid to use informational text as a teacher. So now we're using those, and then we're adding in, a science lesson or a social studies lesson. And what a great way to learn those technical words and not be afraid of them. So hopefully we have a generation of kids that are not like me and that aren't afraid of those big words, right? So I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, and just to react to that, there's a great comment in the chat from Molly who's explaining that her kids love to use big words like visualize, and they kind of show off even when they have classroom guests coming, police officers asking him questions about how he visualizes things. So, I think it is so true. We really do teach a different generation of kids, and it's interesting when you do things like ask kids, after like a book fair, something like a Scholastic book fair, you set out a set of books and you say to a kid, researchers will do this, and they'll say to a kid, what book would you like to keep if you could keep one forever? Turns out they more often actually pick the informational text. So while we as teachers may feel like just a real affinity to a lot of those classics, Charlotte's Web was in our chat earlier, or Chrysanthemum and so many others, they're Velveteen Rabbit. They are beautiful books and kids do need to be exposed to those, but they also need in their sort of healthy diet, some informational text, because that's what's coming to them as they try to go through, their next several years in school, is being able to understand all kinds of vocabulary.
Thank you for adding that. Those are really helpful thoughts as we think about this. And one of the things, so we've talked about, small group, we've talked about a lot of things, but one of the things that we know that's so important in every pre-K classroom is the opportunity for play-based learning. And I do want to just touch upon play and play-based interactions and how we can build teacher conversation into that. And would love to hear a little, Pam, thoughts on how you all are approaching play and conversation in your classes.
Yes, I think the more play in the classroom, the more the kids are going to learn, of course, especially after using those great ReadAlouds and understanding the vocabulary. And going to our play, we always try to create that safe environment, right? And we encourage our kids to take safe chances. We are always providing, like this picture, that multi-sensory materials in that play area, different writing materials. Again, I talked about regard for student perspective. We're always trying to put things in that, everybody's going to be able to use and enjoy. And just being able to discover and take those chances is so important. And, bringing in the pre-K on my way, there you go. You have those questions and just understanding how, and this is something, we're still learning. I talked to you about that earlier, Kathy, is, every theme I go into, I'm learning more and more about Scholastic, and it's amazing. And thinking about this, just prompting these questions as the students are in those independent centers, and talking to them and bringing in the vocabulary and bringing in the what ifs and bringing in the background knowledge for each of these is so important. So in answer to that, that purposeful play is just so important with pre-K.
Thanks, Pamela. Tricia, any thoughts on why you feel like play-based setting is so important to this work around language and vocabulary?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that Pamela said, where basically play is going to lead to some risk taking, maybe whether that's with the creativity of the play that they're doing, or risks around talking to a peer, as we talked about earlier, how important those peer effects are. So there's also really just two types of play in a preschool classroom. There's the free play, where I am just, I'm at the building center and I'm working on my own. But there's also really a teacher guided play, teacher scaffolded play. And that's where the teacher is really intentionally inserting him or herself in ways where you're not going to redirect what they're doing. You're just going to build on what they're doing and scaffold their language. You're going to guide language and, of course, learning, while allowing kids to really select their own activities and how to play together. So I like that, on that next slide, there's prompts where teachers have a variety of questions that they might be asking, and look, they're all open-ended. They're all going to require more than a one-word response, right? Because I guess there is one there that says, can you find books? That's the only one that you can answer with a simple yes or no, but everything else requires a longer sort of multi-word response, which is, again, that brain building moment, right? Those back and forth conversations where we get kids to say multiple things back to us, and then we serve and return back and forth. So that's the reason I think play is also really important, is you can also start to strive for 5 as a teacher as you gradually work around the different centers. And you can elicit help from parent volunteers if they're allowed back in your classrooms now, or from teacher aides. Everyone can strive for 5 at these different play centers.
Awesome. Thank you. That you're right. This is another opportunity for that strive for 5. We mentioned SEL, and I just, before we wrap up, I want to talk a little bit more about that, because really at the heart of it, the social emotional development, the executive function, all of those aspects that are so crucial, the success that our children have is really based on this. And Pamela, I want to go back to you and just kind of hear how you all are addressing these crucially important. They've always been important, and I think the pandemic has really even emphasized all of this more. But I'd love to hear a little bit of your thoughts around social emotional development and really how important that is in being able to be successful in language and vocabulary and everything else that children are expected to do in pre-K.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned to you guys earlier, we do have a great coaching crew staff that goes out to all of our pre-K teachers, and they are just so well-rounded and know so much about SEL. So through our morning messages that they've created, our class tool, as well as all their district coaching, and of course the Scholastic and the mind builders, and that being built into every day. We just really strive to create that positive environment, positive climate with the teachers. And again, just going in and just making our students feel comfortable in the classrooms. And that's just something that we try to model with our teachers every day, and just really try to bring in those students and the families, and just make them feel comfortable in our classrooms, because without that comfort, they are not going to feel confident, and they're not going to be able to learn. And as a parent, they're not going to want to come to our classrooms. So we really push hard for that social and emotional learning piece in Dallas ISD. So
thank you for pointing that out. And Tricia, if you have anything to add around the importance of social emotional, we would love to hear that. And then I'm going to ask Colin to go on to the next slide. Tricia, anything to add?
Well, I just couldn't agree more with what Pamela said. I mean, this year, this is exactly what all the teachers we are working with across the state say. Kids are really coming in with learning gaps, mostly in the social and emotional domain. We, of course, we're seeing it in math and literacy as well, but the major concerns are social emotional, because they haven't been around other kids as much over the last year. So really making sure that you're thinking about how to get kids talking to one another, and how to make sure that you develop a vocabulary for feelings, emotions, and hitting those emotion vocabulary really probably every month or so. You can teach and revisit more complex emotions, because kids are under a lot of stress still with this pandemic, and they need to be able to name what it is they're feeling. Like, why is it my heart is a little bit racing, or why is it that my tummy hurts? Well, that's called feeling anxious, right? You're feeling nervous, right? So kids just need vocabulary to put a name on it, and to normalize it, right? That's also just how, as humans, we realize, yeah, we all go through these things. So
thank you. Well, and that kind of bridges to I want to share just a couple snippets about our new program. And as you talk about the social emotional, I think that was one of the things at the heart of the development team, that they wanted to find literature, and really they did a worldwide search to find literature that speaks to a lot of that social emotional part of the children that they can really relate to, and also finding that literature that's going to be diverse, right? The classrooms have changed, and we want to make sure that those books reflect the children who are in our classrooms. So that was really one of the things at the heart of what we did. And Pamela, it was great that you mentioned Mind Builders, because we were very excited at Scholastic with our partnership with CLI, and also our partnership with the Yale Child Study Center, where we were able to work with Dr. Linda Mays and Dr. Walter Gilliam on those mind builders, which are those social emotional skills that we know are so vitally important. Colin, if you go to the next slide. And then when we were talking about, just the volleys and the strive for 5, one of the things that I think was important when we were laying out the program were those concept questions that really would start getting the conversations going. So throughout the thematic approach with PreK on My Way, that was one of the important things, but also hitting like those social emotional skills around the themes, me and you and our community. And then one of the things that we heard is just when we talk about informational text, that's so appropriate as we do a lot of STEM, science, engineering, mathematics. So a lot of the themes reflect that support in PreK on My Way. Colin? And then Pamela, to your point, using those instructional reading cards and really incorporating Dr. Zucker's body of research on that Strive for 5, for every single read aloud, the 175 books, you're going to have the instructional cards that give you that volley. That's so important. But we didn't stop there. I think in working with Tricia, we also knew how important it was for that differentiation and those adaptations for children that might need more scaffolded support, or children that really can do a challenge question. So that was all built in. And you'll see Clifford, he's always our mascot around the Mind Builders. So those cards, and you saw that in the Dallas pictures, with the teachers having that card, they go right on the back of the book. And those questions that really allow that Strive for 5 conversation are right there. And Colin? We talked about the wonderful vocabulary strategy from developing talkers. And then I think the other great thing is when we talked about small group instruction, having small group activities that teachers can really select from that are going to go right along with what you're doing in circle time, story time in your whole group, and then flow into your centers, which was going to be really important. So that integration, not only of the domains, but also the instruction, that was going to be front and center to what we knew was going to be important in a new program. And everything that is needed is provided. And Colin, we're going to go on because we're just about out of time, and I want to have a minute or two for questions. And then I think the other wonderful thing is, especially coming out of the pandemic, digital became so front and center and so important. And so this program is completely built, and Pamela can probably share more. We're going to give you our emails, but you have digital support for this program. Every print piece is also available in digital. And that was really important to us to be able to provide to all of our teachers. So, and this is just a little example from Dallas. Thank you, Pamela, of a smartboard and a whiteboard being used effectively in a classroom. So with that, I know there were some questions in the chat, and I think we have about 1 minute to be able to answer some of these. Let me go through and see. And Tricia, you might have been able to spot some. I know one we had was around special education. If we have any thoughts on how this can also, the things that we've learned today around oral language, around vocabulary, how can that be adapted for special ed? And I'd also say for ELL, which I know we touched upon.
Right. So both in the pre-K On My Way, as well as, kind of an article I dropped into the chat, there's more information on scaffolding. And so the scaffolding techniques that they're actually already scripted in pre-K On My Way. They're fantastic. They include ways to gradually step down the conversation from a big open-ended question into something that's a more narrow question, or even just something that would elicit a short response from the child. So those sort of scaffolding techniques are very effective with kids who have special needs, because they actually come from speech language pathologist therapy strategies. That's the literature that we drew from when we started piloting those. And it turns out teachers love them and can do them just as effectively as an SLP when they are provided with both training as well as curriculum materials like these that have it already planned out for you. So I would really encourage you to, you can read more about that in the article I dropped in, but you also can just look at pre-K On My Way. It's called Support, and it's a little sort of colored box that pops out on every large group card, on all the small group cards. So it's already designed so that even if you've got an English learner or a child with very limited language, you will still elicit a meaningful and really nice back and forth sort of conversation with them.
Thank you. Pamela, anything to add about that for that one? I do have another question, Pamela, that you may be able to help us with from Nikki. Do we have any tips on how to engage someone who doesn't have many peer-to-peer interactions and would prefer to play alone? Anybody have any thoughts around that?
I would say Dr. Zucker might have something else, but just that constant encouragement and making sure that the student feels safe, and maybe as that educator, that teacher, finding out maybe why they might not feel safe doing something. Is there something going on at home? Is there something going on at school? And without being, too intrusive, just finding out why they don't want to be with. And it may just be, an issue of being shy. It could be something else, but definitely finding out why, and just not giving up on that student. Just finding something, whether it's them having a dog or a cat or something that is that you can relate to with them, just will really help with that trust issue with you and that child, or that child and another student in the classroom. So just building that trust and that relationship is what I would suggest.
Kind of goes back to what you shared around confidence, that confidence building. Yep.
Absolutely.
Right. Tricia?
No, I think Pam's hit it spot on. That safe environment where kids can take risk that they're already working on in DISD. As well as what she said about finding the way in. Sometimes it's a kid's shoes that are Spider-Man, or his shirt that's a team that he wants to talk to you about, that finally gets the child talking, and you have your first sort of strive for 5 with them. And once you've unlocked that, they're going to start to trust you and realize, okay, you're the kind of conversational partner who's not testing me. Like, you really just want to hear my perspective, right? And so that's what's great about just scaffolding, and it helps kids feel seen, heard, and build trust, because they know that you're going to be responsive to them.
Thank you so much. And I know we're running over, so the last question, I just want to get this in because it was in the chat, a little bit about families and what we can do to help families inspire these conversations at home. So that was one of the things. I'm hoping the Strive for 5 could go home, but I would love to hear, Pamela, what you're doing in Dallas, and Tricia, if you have any good tips, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I think this is one area that, again, going back to, the classroom, teachers have to get outside of their comfort zone and talk to the families, find out what the families need. I know that Scholastic has the family engagement piece that comes in English and Spanish, but we also have to reach out to those families that need more than that. And just talking to those families, finding out what they need. And if you have a classroom of 22 kids, how many of those caregivers do you know? Do you know all 22 of them? Have you talked to all 22 of them? What is their way of communication? Is it email? Is it text? Really get into understanding how that family works and not being afraid of that. You're going to have those families, like I always said, I always call it my Nana. It's my Nana that's too young to be my Nana. She would do anything to this day for me. But it was just building those relationships with that family. And a lot of times as teachers, we think, oh, they won't help us, or they won't do this, or they're not going to do that. But they're not going to do something that they don't know how to do, and that they don't feel comfortable doing, and they don't feel trust in you, that you're going to back them up if they make a mistake. So again, it goes back to building that trust even with the families outside of the classroom.
Thanks, Pamela. That's such great guidance. Tricia?
Yeah, I agree with Pamela. Some families it's a phone call, some families it's a text, making sure that as you come up on your first parent teacher conferences around that beginning of your data, that you're offering options. Like video conference might be the way that you can get a lot of parents to participate who might not have otherwise. So just giving options, because some parents will want to come and see you face to face. So thinking about the modality that's best for parents. And also I think all the time about how, as a parent, I say to my kids when I pick them up, how was school today? And you get fine, right? Like, of course that falls flat. And that's not really a place that a family can readily strive for 5. But one of my favorite things that we do in our research, and Scholastic's come up with a way for you all to do it as well, is to just tell parents a question to ask the kids that relates to what you've been reading that week. So you can send a text message home, but the cool thing that Scholastic has is what's called chat bands, and you just cut out a question of the week, and kids wear it home on Friday around their wrist. And so, when your kid comes home with a little paper bracelet on, you're probably going to ask them things like, oh, well, yeah, tell me about people in our community that we interact with, just like you've been talking about as you've read the book. Thank you, Omu. So that gives parents who, like me, tend to default to the how was your day. It gives them something a little more meaty to work with here.
It's funny, those chat bands, I have a 4-year-old granddaughter that I need chat bands for her. So it's so true. Those are great to be able to get those conversations going. Well, would love you, as we finish up, all of our audience, if you have a key takeaway, something that you would love to take back to your class, make a difference, please put that in the chat. We have, I think, lots of key takeaways thanks to our amazing panelists. Dr. Zucker and Pamela, I just can't thank you enough. I learned so much, and I'm hoping that the folks that joined us today did as well.